The evening had fallen heavy over the small-town courthouse, the kind of building that looked far older than the people who still worked inside it. Its wooden benches were polished smooth from years of weary citizens sitting and waiting for justice, though justice was not always what people walked away with. On this particular night, the courthouse was unusually crowded. A case had stirred whispers through the town and dragged a nervous tension into the air, one that clung to the walls and made everyone's heart beat just a little faster. Two Navy SEALs, men who had dedicated their lives to serving their country, stood accused of crimes no one could have believed they were capable of. And standing behind those accusations was a single man, a police officer whose corruption ran deeper than most in the town cared to admit. The two SEALs were brought into the courtroom in shackles, wearing bright orange prison uniforms that seemed to strip them of the respect their uniforms once commanded. Their posture, however, told another story. Even bound and accused, they stood tall, shoulders squared, their eyes locked straight ahead with the discipline that had been drilled into them through years of service. They did not protest, did not cry out at the injustice, did not even glare at their accuser. They remained as steady as stone, as though they knew patience and silence would speak louder than any desperate attempt to clear their names. The corrupt cop, on the other hand, entered the room like he owned it. His smug expression carried the arrogance of a man who had grown comfortable abusing the badge that hung over his chest. He moved with a swagger, every step screaming that he believed he had already won. He had crafted his lies carefully, weaving a tale that painted the SEALs not as heroes but as criminals. He claimed they had interfered in his investigation, resisted arrest, and even assaulted him during what he insisted was a lawful operation. To the untrained ear, it almost sounded convincing. To those who knew better, it was the desperate attempt of a man clinging to power he did not deserve. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, adjusted his glasses and peered over the top of them as the accused were led to their place. The murmur of the crowd subsided, leaving behind the faint rustle of papers and the steady creak of the old wooden floor. He had seen many cases in his long career, but something about this one felt different. He could sense the tension, the way the room seemed to be divided not by evidence, but by something invisible. An undercurrent of fear and anticipation. The prosecutor, leaning heavily on the cop's fabricated account, began laying out the so-called facts of the case. He spoke with practiced authority, listing charges in a way designed to sound irrefutable. Words like obstruction, assault, and misconduct echoed through the courtroom, painting the two men in orange as dangerous and reckless. Each accusation felt like a knife thrown toward their character. Each sentence, another attempt to dismantle their years of honorable service. Still, the SEALs did not flinch. They stood at attention, as though awaiting orders, as though the courtroom itself had become another battlefield where patience would serve them better than aggression. The audience watched closely, their eyes shifting between the men in uniform and the cop who had dragged them here. Whispers rippled quietly from bench to bench, speculation flying from one ear to another. Some in the room doubted the cop's story but were too fearful to say it out loud. Others, perhaps swayed by his position, believed his lies without question. The divide was palpable, but above it all, the silence of the SEALs cut sharper than any argument. Their calm presence raised a question in the minds of many. Could men who had faced enemies on foreign soil, who had bled for their country, really be guilty of something so small, so petty? The cop shifted in his seat, occasionally glancing toward the two men he had accused. For a moment, despite his confident posture, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew who they were. He knew what they were capable of. His lies might hold weight with those who didn't understand the world these men came from, but deep down, he knew he had tangled with the wrong people. And yet greed and fear of exposure pushed him forward. He had crossed a line long ago, and now there was no turning back. To admit the truth would destroy him, so he doubled down on his lies, clinging to the hope that his badge would shield him as it always had. The defense attorney for the SEALs was a young man, sharp but visibly overwhelmed. He shuffled his papers, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to counter the accusations. He pointed to inconsistencies in the cop's testimony, gaps that didn't quite add up, but each objection was brushed aside with practiced ease. The cop, after all, was a familiar face in the courthouse, a man the system trusted, or at least tolerated. The young lawyer fought bravely, but the weight of the courtroom leaned against him like a tide threatening to pull him under. And so the SEALs remained silent, watching, waiting. They had endured worse than this before. They had faced battles where every second meant life or death. This was just another kind of battlefield, one where the enemy wore a badge instead of a uniform. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing moment. The cop's words filled the room like smoke, suffocating truth and painting lies as reality. The audience leaned in, their faces etched with curiosity and disbelief. The judge rubbed his temple, weary from the performance but unwilling to cut it short. And in the middle of it all, the SEALs remained statuesque, their silence louder than any denial. They knew something the others didn't. They knew that their story wasn't finished here, that their fate wouldn't be sealed by the words of a corrupt officer. The cop smirked once more, confidence returning as he saw the courtroom swaying in his favor. He pictured himself walking out victorious, his enemies shackled and silenced, his reputation intact. He thought the system would protect him as it always had, blind to his corruption, deaf to the truth. He had no idea that beyond those courtroom doors, change was already coming. But in this moment, inside these four walls, he believed he was untouchable. The SEALs, though, stood taller, their eyes betraying a knowledge that the cop could never understand. They knew their Admiral was on his way. They knew the storm had not yet begun. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and a sudden hush fell over the crowd. Every head turned, every whisper died on the spot. The air itself seemed to shift as the man stepped through the doorway, his presence commanding the room before he even spoke a single word. Dressed in a crisp naval uniform adorned with medals that reflected years of valor and sacrifice, the Admiral moved forward with steady, purposeful strides. His face was stern, his jaw set, his eyes sharp as steel. He was the kind of man who carried authority in every line of his posture, the kind of leader whose very arrival demanded respect, even from those who did not know his name. The two SEALs in orange lifted their heads the moment he entered, a spark flashing in their otherwise calm expressions. They did not smile, they did not speak, but the recognition in their eyes was clear. This was their commanding officer, the man who had led them through darker storms than anyone in this courthouse could imagine. Their silence deepened, not out of fear, but out of certainty. The battlefield had just shifted, and they knew victory no longer seemed like a distant hope. The corrupt cop felt the weight of the Admiral's entrance before he even looked up. His smug expression faltered, lips twitching as though caught between a grin and a grimace. He turned slightly in his seat, his confidence draining as recognition hit him. He knew exactly who had just entered, and suddenly the courtroom didn't feel so small, so safe. The badge on his chest felt flimsy now, like a shield made of paper. The man approaching commanded fleets, not traffic stops. He led warriors, not paper pushers, and in his eyes there was no room for corruption. The Admiral came to a stop in the center aisle, his gaze sweeping the room. When he finally spoke, his voice rolled like thunder across the benches. "Who do you think you've arrested?" His words carried not only authority, but disbelief, as though the very idea of seeing his men in chains was an insult to the institution of justice itself. Murmurs erupted instantly from the crowd, spreading like wildfire. The judge leaned back slightly, his brows furrowing as he adjusted his glasses again. He hadn't been warned of this, hadn't expected a man of such stature to walk into his courtroom. The cop swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He tried to regain composure, to sit taller, but the Admiral's stare pinned him down like a nail to wood. "These men," the Admiral continued, pointing toward the two SEALs, "are among the finest soldiers this nation has. They have stood on foreign soil, risked their lives for the freedom of every citizen in this room. And you dare bring them here, dressed like criminals, on charges that reek of fabrication. The defense attorney, young and nervous, stood speechless. He had never expected such backup, never dreamed that a man of this caliber would enter to defend his clients. The prosecutor's jaw tightened, his carefully rehearsed arguments suddenly sounding fragile in the shadow of the Admiral's words. The judge cleared his throat, trying to maintain control of the courtroom. "Admiral," he began cautiously, "this is a legal proceeding. You must understand that the evidence. The Admiral snapped, his tone cutting through the judge's words like a blade. What evidence could possibly exist that turns warriors into thugs? What evidence could justify shackling men who have been decorated for bravery, who have bled for this country while others sat comfortably at home? If you have such evidence, then I demand to see it, because until then, this is nothing but an insult to the uniform they wear." The audience gasped. The cop shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading at his temples. His plan had been simple: smear the seals, lean on his badge, and let the system carry him through as it always had. But he hadn't counted on this. He hadn't counted on the Admiral himself walking into the courtroom, his voice carrying the weight of an entire navy behind it. The seals remained silent, but their presence felt stronger now, bolstered by the Admiral's defense. They stood taller, their eyes locked on their commander as though drawing strength from his words. For them, this was more than a trial. It was a test of loyalty, of whether the truth could stand against lies. And in that moment, they knew their Admiral would not let them fall. The judge shifted again, glancing between the Admiral and the cop. "Order in the court," he muttered, banging his gavel lightly, though his voice lacked the firmness it usually carried. The gavel's echo sounded weak compared to the Admiral's thunder. "We will proceed with facts, not emotion. Then let us lay out the facts." The Admiral replied, stepping closer, his boots echoing against the floor. "Fact, these men were on leave, not on duty when they were targeted by this officer. Fact, witnesses saw no resistance, no crime committed until this officer laid hands on them. Fact, this officer has a history of complaints that were conveniently buried under paperwork. How much more fact do you require before you admit that this entire case is a farce?" Gasps rippled again, this time heavier, louder. The crowd stirred, murmurs growing bolder, people whispering about corruption, about truth. The cop's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but every word stuck in his throat under the Admiral's glare. He had always been feared in this small town, but now fear wrapped itself around him instead, coiling tighter with every second. The prosecutor looked uneasy, papers shuffling in his hands as though suddenly meaningless. He knew the Admiral's words held weight beyond this courtroom, beyond this town. No jury, no judge, no crowd could easily dismiss them. The judge, too, felt the shift, his authority slipping under the Admiral's relentless truth. The Admiral turned his gaze back to the cop. "When you put those cuffs on my men, did you think no one would notice? Did you think their brothers in arms, their chain of command, would simply let it slide? You've picked a fight with men who have survived war zones, and now you face a war you cannot win, because this war is against the truth." The cop's hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists on his knees. His once steady confidence had crumbled into dust, leaving behind a hollow man stripped of his power. The crowd could see it now. The lies were unraveling. The story he had built so carefully was falling apart under the weight of the Admiral's words. Silence followed, a silence heavy enough to feel. The seals stood unflinching, the Admiral looming like a storm in the heart of the courtroom. The judge stared down at his bench, uncertain, while the audience waited breathlessly, and in that silence the cop realized the truth: he had lost.